Hello everyone, welcome back to another video installment here. Today we're going to cover a lot of different topics. We have a lot of information that's come to us along with some decks and getting ready for Seattle. Seattle's going to be the last DLC before we get into the nitty-gritty of Continentals with set 6, with Azurite Sea, I believe it's called. I'm bad with the names of all of them, but yes, Lorcana Challenge in October here in Seattle, just about a week away from today as we're recording this. How that's going to play out, what decks to play, what decks to look out for. I'm going to start a video series here of all the decks I think that could be competitive. Starting with the deck we're going to cover today here, of course, that I'm going to try bringing to a local store championship this weekend, most likely. And kind of following up on that, any kind of details and how that's going to parlay into this here, the Disneyland Paris Continental, which is coming up in just a few short weeks. It feels like we're really about 6 weeks out, I believe. I think maybe 6 or 7 weeks. I think 7 weeks actually. But that and how that's going to parlay into Continentals for North America, which is going to be January, I believe, 8th, 9th, and 10th. Hopefully I booked the right days for my flight. And if you want to hear me talk about certain specifics on how I feel about the tournament structure, all that, go check it out here on my Twitch. I did a video there just a short little while ago about the announcements that were made, what that means for us as a whole, what I like, what I don't like. If you're here for that, all good. But let's dive into the deck I'm going to be covering off today. Deck we've not seen do particularly well. It's been here and there in some different metagames, in different people's hands. Blue Steel. It's a deck I did fancy quite a bit last format prior to release of set 5. And it's gotten some upgrades, some downgrades, a lot of tools every which way. But yeah, we're going to go into detail about this specific deck here, mainly focusing on some of the cards that we're adding to the deck that we may have seen fall in and out of favor of the previous format, mainly Aerial. But yeah, I'm going to dive right here in just a moment. And a brief aside, you can see at the top right there, LadyLore20.com, really cool place to get a lot of really cool stickers for your collection there. I have this set up here where I'm looking at all their shops here. We have different color different faction kind of stickers, which I have a whole set of here. Not sponsored anyway, just love these things and wish they kind of gave them out at all the DLCs as a way to kind of help influence or balance the play draw disparity in some ways. The unknown information, if you're announcing your colors prior to the start of the game, game one, it kind of makes it a little bit more level playing field and shows more of the skill of knowing how to approach each matchup more so than the matchup variance that we experience. So these are super cool. Go there, check it out. I'll have a link in the comments below, I believe, if I remember correctly. But yeah, LadyLore20.com there. Go check it out. But moving right along, we're going to go section by section here. Again, from the deck, we're going to break it down by what the cards do and kind of what the overall strategy is and kind of a retrospect afterwards. So starting off here, we have the cards you kind of want to see in your opening hand pretty much every game. These are the acceleration pieces. We have Tipo, One Jump Ahead, and Fishbone Quill. These things have been synonymous since the format started, whether it be in Ruby Sapphire or any other of the Sapphire decks. Tipo has really shown that it's one of the better ways to accelerate when you don't care as much about the card disadvantage that it does provide. This deck, above any of the other acceleration-based decks, any Sapphire decks, cares about the card disadvantage the least because of, well, a whole new world, which we'll get to. So much so that in this deck, I've actually slimmed down on a copy of One Jump Ahead down to 3. I do think, again, on the side of Mickey versus One Jump Ahead, that acceleration on turn 2 is far more important than on turn 3. However, Fishbone Quill is a giant exception because it really parlays you from 3 to 6 versus 3 to 5, and being able to double accelerate into a late game or propel yourself going forward into the very, very late game where sometimes you want even multiple Fishbone Quills is kind of one of the best Sapphire cards, and one of the reasons that Sapphire is doing as well as it does is because of Fishbone Quill. Yeah, not really much to say about these pieces specifically. Tipo, of course, getting the nod to being 4 versus 3, mainly because it's inkable. This deck got to cut back on a lot of its uninkable count, mainly because of how the removals kind of shaped out in the format, less than anything else, which we'll get to. But yeah, this deck actually only 14 uninkables, where previous versions have had 16 or 18, which I was always kind of on the fence about how many felt correct, because this deck wants to remain flexible, just like Amber Steel Songs in a lot of ways. But the other section of cards here is the kind of Cantrip, the filler cards, which Popsicle and Fortisphere are very important for this deck. One of the reasons to play this deck, oddly enough, is Fortisphere. Not the effect so much, but because of the critical mass you can get and power out cards like Aerial to really make them much more likely to be turned on in that way. against any deck, even playing items. These ones I don't really feel are negotiable. The only negotiation you can have with this set of cards you see here are if you really want a 4th copy of One Chip Ahead, which I could certainly see being defensible, honestly. But I think I want to make room for some of the other cards in the deck before really, cutting more copies of that card or cutting anything further. But this many copies of the cards mean that I think you're going to have that acceleration on turn 2 every single time. Again, I've had a lot of games, especially against Green Steel, where cards like Fishbone Coil are actually not very good. One of the things you're seeing a lot of the Ruby Sapphire decks doing is playing Great Stone Dragon over Fishbone Coil or complementary to it, because Fishbone Coil inherently is card disadvantage. You're kind of throwing away a full card to have the option to throw away more cards. So if they're trying to hypnotize or sudden chill you, it's really not going to work out very well if you're not able to refill your hand quickly. And this deck, however, can do that better than pretty much any other deck. It has the most powerful card draw engines that Sapphire and Steel have to offer, which really, those two, outside of Amethyst card draw with Rabbits and Friends on their side, is kind of king, these two. So moving to the next bit here, we're going to go into the removal suite. This has changed a bit. This is the main reason I don't like this deck at the start of most formats, is because what removal you have to play is kind of unknown at a lot of points and kind of hard to figure out what the right combination of these things are. There used to be copies of Along Came Zeus, which I've removed. There's used to be less copies of Let It Go. There used to be no copies of Smash and more focused on Baboom. But a lot of factors have changed into making those numbers, I think, incorrect, or just need to kind of change as a whole to adapt to the format. This is one of the most adaptable decks to the format and needs to be tailored to the right metagame to fight. Smash is super important. We've seen the Emerald decks play Ursula, which can be a pain when you're trying to keep a certain amount of cards in the hand, do a balancing act of how to develop my Singer into playing a whole new world, and when they can double sudden chill off of an Ursula, it's super hard to deal with, and sometimes Diablo can be an issue for this deck, and they all are running some copies of Hidden Cove, which really pushes Diablo out of range, and you really do need to answer that early. It is a card that can definitely be problematic as the game goes on if you are not able to resolve a whole new world or don't really want to because you don't have that much of an acceleration package going where you weren't able to get too far ahead early and you had to play more conservatively with your ramp because they were trying to tax your hand with this card. So you had to kind of grind a bit more, fight pound for pound. Maybe you have similar to amount of ink to them, or you had to play a Let It Go already. So Smash really being able to stop Diablo, even under the assumption that there's a Hidden Cove in play, is pretty important. And of course, Smash has to line up against some of the incredible Amber cards that we've gotten, like Prince Naveen. It doesn't work as well against Daisy. That's been the crux of this deck, and if you're expecting a Daisy-heavy field, I would recommend not playing this deck. But against really this deck is built to counter, in a lot of ways, Green Steel. It's one of Green Steel's worst matchups, and it can have game against Amber Steel. I think it's a little bit weak to it. I think it's been one of the issues with this format and reasons I haven't touched it really since, because Amber Steel was so popular to begin with and very powerful in all rights, that it was really pushed out by Amber Steel. People have said both sides of the matchup are good. I've long been in the camp that Amber Steel is quite favored. There were moments in time where it was in one side's favor, namely Amber Steel, but people could be convinced otherwise. But I do believe that this deck is on the wrong side of threats versus answers when it comes to that specific matchup. So having, cards like Smash Your deck is more of a concession again to all the 3 health characters running around, namely again Prince Naveen, Diablo with Hidden Cove, Ursula. Ursula, of course, gets around it with Hidden Cove, but that's a bit of a tall order on turn 3 to have that lined up, where Diablo you can much more easily set that up. No copies of Along Came Zeus does make you more vulnerable to cards like Beast, but there are plenty of ways to answer Beast in this deck or ignore it for the most part, whether it be Grab Your Sword, Tinkerbell, all kind of check Beast in a lot of ways, and I'm not too concerned with that card running away with the game as much as I am Diablo just remaining unanswered. But Let It Go, a concession to how popular Ruby Sapphire has been. You really need to answer Tamatoa on site. You could play copies of cards like Hades, but I do find that Let It Go just is a more efficient answer and can be sung, of course. In that matchup is pretty important when you're trying to do more than one thing in a turn. And while Hades is fine, it does get Medusa'd, and you'll notice a pattern with this deck. Not many of the cards actually do get Medusa'd. Obviously, when you factor in the ice block, there's a lot of cards or anything gets Medusa, and that's fine. But a lot of the Ruby Sapphire decks I've seen have been trimming on Medusa, maybe down to 2 or 3. I've seen 2, which I was surprised by, but 3 is about where I expect to see Medusa these days. Much less so than it was before because they're so invested in the Sisu plan. But this removal suite seems to be where it's at. Tinkerbell plus Grab Your Sword has been a staple since set 1 in decks that can utilize it. I've had it in and out of Amber Steel, this format entirely. It's been a really big kind of debate as to how you want to approach the deck or approach the format, whether you want to be on that side of the fence where you're really knocking out all the other decks besides Ruby Sapphire, or if you want to be a little more low to the ground, a little more aggressive and not include these cards, but have a little bit better game against Ruby Sapphire, but kind of give up points elsewhere. And ultimately, I'm not sure. Amber Steel Songs is a very tricky deck to get the right configuration of, and it really is mostly irrelevant, honestly. That's a tricky one to really answer. But with this deck, I think since you want to develop both the Singer for cards like Holo World, and you don't really have the Aerials, the 3-cost Aerial Singers in Amber, you need cards like Tinkerbell to really be a way to catch back up. And since you can curve Fishbone Quill into Tinkerbell, natural progression of the game is going to have you want to play a big impactful card like Tinkerbell that makes it hard for your opponent to quest. And then, of course, being able to sing, grab your sword, and play Tinkerbell in the same turn clears most of what your opponent can possibly do. But yeah, this is the removal suite I landed on. There's no copies of Baboom, there's no copies of Let It Go, there's no copies of any other character removal in the deck besides these. And I think this is enough. So let's move next up here to some of the more flexible cards. These are the ones that are kind of in and out, hard to figure the right numbers of. There's a lot of things you can do to really customize the deck, and I think these are some of the slots I'm dedicating to doing that slight customization. Pete, we've known and seen in every Steel deck really since this format's come out, which was no surprise to me. I think it's the best card in set 5. Pete is just highly impactful, and you need sometimes ways to fight back. It's not necessarily part of your your A plus game plan, like what you want to be doing specifically, but it's more so there to help protect or catch back up in certain situations where you have an overwhelming advantage and you just need to get one more turn out of the deal to develop a bunch of things and then quest, where they then can't cast Be Prepared if they're playing Ruby Amethyst or Ruby Sapphire or a bunch of different songs out of Amber Steel, because you can be behind in that matchup. Cogsworth, this is the first time I've removed a Cogsworth from the deck. I'm actually tempted to remove more. I think Cogsworth's been at its worst. It's really only good against the Steel variants, which I don't know if it's necessary in those matchups. It's more necessary to take against Green Steel than Amber Steel. Amber Steel can ignore it, and I've been a big proponent of playing many copies of Cinderella Stouthearted to deal with cards out of Steel Song, and Cogsworth's one of the cards on the list to help deal with. So it's not as much of a powerhouse, I believe, as it used to be. It'll still feel amazing in games. It'll still win you some games by itself, but not as necessary. And really the fact that it dies to the 4 copies of Sisu that Ruby Sapphire plays is one of its biggest boons right now, and one of the reasons I've removed one. Still want it, but it's not as amazing widespread as it used to be. It used to be pretty hard for a lot of the Ruby Sapphire decks to deal with because they were playing maybe 1 or 2 copies of Sisu and 4 Be Prepared, so you were kind of, having it be vulnerable no matter what, because they can Maui it, they could sometimes Tremaine it, and also Be Prepared it. But now that they're really leaning into Sisu, if you could do things to mitigate that aspect, it's going to be pretty important. But yeah, still a good card in some matchups against Steel specifically, of course. Just manage it correctly and use it to sing appropriately. It's not always the greatest against Amethyst as well. Fox and Maui and Crab give it some trouble, but a lot of ways around that too. Beast, Hard-Headed, and Cusco. They are very different. They both do different things, and I think you want a mix of them. Beast is pretty direct, right? Beast is direct. It kills an item. That's great. It's narrow, but it's great at what it does. When you can, in a Fishbone Quill kind of mirror match, or even against an Ice Block, be able to just take it out at a pinch, even against Amber Steel Songs, whether they play Lanterns or anything else, or any other item deck, anything with items in it, taking it out, pretty efficient. 4/4 body means that it's gonna tussle with cards like Medusa. If you take out Ice Block, it's going to survive that interaction, put you a little bit ahead in that way too. It's also a good singer. With the removal of one of the Cogsworths, you really need to have that effect. And a lot of times against some of the Ruby Sapphire decks, I don't want to accelerate them. They have a hard time sometimes managing the amount of card flow that they have against this deck, because they have to use a lot of resources to play an early and late game at times, with both emptying their hand with Hole in the World and also maintaining a certain number of threats, where I don't want to give them an ink all the time. That's the reason you'll see more Cuscos. That is a drawback. There is a drawback to Cusco. However, Cusco, moving on to that card here, has a very high upside. There are multifacets to how Cusco will work. I used to be a bit more impressed with Cusco when I had Mufasa in this deck. There's no Mufasa in this deck, unfortunately. I wanted to, but I don't think I can justify it. Hitting locations is huge. Being able to take out a Queen's Castle was one of the biggest one of the biggest issues for this deck. You used to had to play cards like Rise of the Titans to take it out. You can play other cards like Hideaway, which are pretty efficient, and also I think I might want to eventually try and fit one copy of Hideaway in this deck for other reasons too, but Cusco has the ability to take out locations, which is a massive win for a card like this. However, one of its biggest uses and why I really like the card and why I initially had 4 copies of it in the deck before I had to manage the curve a bit better was hitting your own items. You hit your own item, your own Popsicle, your own Fortress Sphere, whatever it is, on turn probably 4. If you go, let's just say, a modest curve of Popsicle into nothing on turn 2, into Quill, and then turn 4 Cusco, inking your Popsicle, and then the next turn after that you get to ink up to 8, ink to 9 with the Quill, and then play a whole new world. On turn 5 you have 9 ink in play, and Cusco helped get an ink out of the deal. One of the biggest things Cusco can do is hit your own ink, own items to ink, whether it be typically just a Popsicle or Fortress Sphere in that instance. You don't really want to hit any of your other ones, but it is very flexible, and of course its main use, and a lot of people, what they see it for is be able to put a lucky dime on the opposing side into the inkwell so it cannot be brought back by Tomato. That is real. That does happen. It is very frustrating if you're on the receiving end of that, if you can't make use of the ink in a very meaningful way. It's a great answer there. And of course, if you have nothing else going on, activating its 4-cost ability to give your characters resist once the end of turn, you can do multiple times if you just need to protect against a card like Grab Your Swords or other steel removal against Amber Steel Songs. But yeah, Cusco is fantastic. I wish I could play more. I think I needed another card that costs 5 in the deck is one of the main reasons against it. And Beast was a good stat line. It dodges the Medusa. It helps take out some of the items that you don't really want to hit too much. I really want to use Cusco for problematic locations or Lucky Dime on my opponent's side, or hitting my own things where Beast I really just want to hit those ice blocks with. You'll definitely use Cusco on an ice block if you have to. It's not as meaningful because it still dies to Medusa as is, but it dodges Brawl in that sense and dodges Sisu if that happens too, but much less excited to do it in that vein as to accelerate myself or get rid of a Lucky Dime. But yeah, these are the flexible slots. These are the ones I think can go in and out. I like Pete. It does help bridge a gap a bit. It lets you kind of, in some ways, manual a whole new world against Amber Steel Songs. Going back to Pete here. Turn 3 Quill, turn 4 ink up to 6, play Pete, and then you can go ink up to 8, play a whole new world for 5. Doesn't feel great, but it stops them from using too many resources to really attack your hand or deploy too much. But Pete, amazing card, one of the best cards in the set, if not the best card in the set, and has a home in many steel decks. Really kind of hard to get around that card. But let's move on to the next bit here. These cards are flexible, but great. The card draw. We talked about whole new world a bit. I think we haven't talked about the other key pieces, which I think everyone's come to love and or hate, depending on how you view these cards. Grammatala, pretty flexible, gets around Diablo as far as its card draw. Adding cards to your hand while maintaining board presence is always important. Has a meaningful body. Honestly, a 3/3 is not that bad. I'm a big fan of Prince Naveen, as you guys might know, and it being just a 4-cost 3/3 that recoups a card is pretty great sometimes. Helps check a Flynn in some matchups, which this deck may struggle a little bit more against Ruby Amethyst than it did prior because of the lack of Babooms and no Arguses, which I've included prior as some of the flex slot cards. But Grammatala does a great job. It helps bridge the gap a lot of the times. It makes up for the going down a full card with Tipo, because Tipo, when I say go down a full card, you're essentially, when you play a Tipo, it's almost like an action that lets you put a card in your hand into your inkwell as opposed to the top of your deck. However, it's also inkable, and however you get a 1/2, but this deck doesn't really want a 1/2 body, so it's really kind of irrelevant in a lot of ways. But Grammatala, and honestly, Tipo, backtracking, is one of the main reasons we don't see the cards like Be King Undisputed anymore. That's the main reason we don't see that card at all, because Tipo kind of invalidates it as just kind of fodder. But Grammatala, great way to recoup cards, way to dig, way to put a body that can trade out there, whether it be against an Aerial, against a Naveen, against, even attacking with a Grammatala and then smashing to kill a Hiram is relevant. Attacking with a Tala and then hitting a Robin Hood is relevant with Smash. So like all those things are very relevant. 3 points is nothing to scoff at, and it's relatively free. It costs 4 one time, but you can kind of recoup that, disadvantaged by the fact that you have so much ink in play. And next up here, Hiram Flavorsham. I don't think there's much introduction needed. I still think this card ultimately was a mistake. I saw the eroded version where it only drew 1 card. I think that's much more reasonable. If it was only drawing 1 card, or if it was uninkable, or if it only triggered on quests, not play, that would have been much more reasonable of a card to have printed. This one, a little unreasonable, very powerful, and when I say this deck has the best card draw, I mean the 2 best card draw engines in the game are Hiram Flavorsham and Whole New World. There's no way around it. Those are the best 2 ways to draw cards in the entire game. Friends on the other side somehow has been outclassed already. It was in set 2, and of course always second to Hole in the World there. But yeah, not much to say about these. You have more items than anyone else as far as ones that are pretty free to play in Fortisphere and Popsicle. Hiram's great there, and Whole New World. Yeah, I've seen many versions without Whole New World, and I can't quite fathom that. It's still the best card, or one of the best cards in the game. It's definitely in the top 5 as far as most powerful cards. And yeah, this deck getting to utilize cards like Tipo, Fishbone Quill, all the extra ink you can use to make a massive board state to then get around pretty much any situation or get out of almost any situation. Home World is just being able to refill that hand on the push of a button is just far beyond anything you could possibly imagine. I can't fathom playing this deck without it. I don't understand the decks that don't play it as much. I think they're templated a little bit weird if they don't play it. Maybe if you're not playing Fishbone Quill, then you can play it in a blue steel style deck, which is much more character based. But when you're playing Fishbone Quill, I think I 100% want Hole in the World, and it's really, again, hard to get around that interaction there. So this is the card draw. You have a ton of things there. This is why I think that this deck's really good against green steel. You have 8 incredible card draw cards that they really can't do much about. Yeah, they can Ursula your Hole in the World, but you rarely will keep a Hole in the World with this deck, much like Amber Steel. There's some situations where you may or may not, but in any case, you have just this insane card that when you draw it, if you draw it at any point, just resets the game and puts you really far ahead. There was some debate to put Visions of the Future in this deck to help find a Hole in the World, more copies of ways to find it. That does seem reasonable. I don't see quite the way to fit it in this deck yet. I've long since toyed with the ideas of playing more than 60 cards. You can do that to make room for it. You kind of worsen some of your odds and other things, but there's a lot of math that needs to be done to figure that exact line out if that's how you want to look at the deck. But yeah, card draw. Card draw is good. Last up here, we have the win conditions. We're doing all these things, right? We're doing all these things. We're removing some characters. We're accelerating. What are we doing with all this? No Stranger, Lucky Dime, and Tamato are here. Those are kind of the end game pieces that's been the bane of many people's existences, or, a champion of many people's successes. This pair is not going to go anywhere for quite a while, I don't believe. It's going to be hard to outclass this, and if they do, I'm very scared. But it's picked up a friend that's been in and out of this deck. I played 2 copies in Chicago where I top 8'd. Aerial Treasure Collector. I think it's gotten new life in this metagame, and I think it's also very necessary, which is unfortunate because I don't really enjoy playing the card. It's a fine card, but it's not really my cup of tea when it comes to cards I want to play. I want to remain flexible, be able to do multiple things, and kind of build strategies around game plans that my opponent will try and enact and me try and counter in some ways. And Aerial being, of course, a higher cost on Inkable doesn't let me do that too much. However, backtracking to Ruby Sapphire's change in deck building, where they've gone to many more copies of Sisu versus Be Prepared, Aerial kind of laughs in the face of Sisu. It cannot be Ice Blocked, it cannot be Medusa Brawled Sisu'd, it can only be Prepared. And when they only have 1 or 2 copies in their deck, maybe usually 2 is about the average I've seen, hard to kill, really hard to make use of. And most of the time when your opponent plays a Be Prepared in that matchup, I'm pretty ecstatic, because that usually means I can take advantage of that and play a Hole in the World and kind of propel forward around what they're doing. So Aerial, really a concession to Ruby Sapphire. I've always thought that match was very close, and you have to build your deck a certain way to be able to combat it, but it's certainly possible to win. I played it 3 times in Chicago last format, and I beat it all 3 times when playing Blue Steel into Ruby Sapphire. I'm sure a lot of people think the matchup is in their favor one way or another. Again, it may come down to skill and specific decisions you make at certain times, but Aerial definitely tips the scale, I believe, in one direction there, making it be an effective threat that is incredibly hard to deal with for them. And you also just have the option, since you have so many more items than Ruby Sapphire, to preempt their removal effects with Lucky Dime to then play Tamatoa and then Lucky Dime it. That is a little bit more risky now because of cards like Hideaway, but it's really hard for your opponent to do that when you have the option to just Hole in the World their hand away, and they have to have it kind of at the right time for that to work out. Or you can play Lucky Dime and Pete in the same turn and prevent them from Hideawaying and then develop your Tamatoa after. If you can't play Tamatoa in the same turn or don't want to expose it to a Maleficent Dragon beforehand. So setting up turns where you Lucky Dime and Pete in the same turn is pretty important to then prevent Hideaway. Of course, they can Cusco it if they're running it, but I've seen more Hideaways than Cuscos. But yeah, this deck is super flexible. These are the ways to win the game with it. Super big fan of all this deck can do. Again, I'm going to probably play this this weekend at one of my store championships for fun to see how it goes. Unfortunately, will not be in Seattle, but this is one of the decks I would consider playing, and actually did consider playing up until the point of me deciding I'm not going to go, just for family obligations. We have stuff going on that weekend. Had plans since January, so couldn't really make the trip out there. But this is the first deck of many. Again, look for one probably each day leading up to Seattle. We're going to go through kind of my 6 picks for decks I would both expect to see or would play, and specific variations of them. And good luck at Site Championships this weekend. Check out ladylore20.com for really cool stuff there. But until next time, I will see you later.